Welcome to the Ephesiology Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the early Christian movement and its implications for the church today. Today we are joined by Michael, our resident ecclesiologist. I'm Andrew Johnson, pastor at Neartown Church in Houston, Texas, and it is our great honor today to be joined by Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. So we'll go through the big paragraph describing how awesome Dr. Pryor is. She has written the book on reading well, finding the good life through great books. She is constantly speaking all over the nation. She is a writer for Christianity Today, The Atlantic, Washington Post, New York Times, Vox. She is a contributing editor for Comment. She's a founding member of the Pelican Project, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, a senior fellow at the International Alliance for Christian Education. And at one point in her life, she decided to fight a bus. And then It might sound like the bus won, but since she's sitting with us today, I actually say, Dr. Pryor, you were the winner. So, Dr. Pryor, welcome to our podcast.
Oh, what a victory.
Well, we've got to hear this now. You can't just throw out that she fought a bus and then we don't talk about it.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for having me here. And 5 years ago, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and entered a crosswalk and didn't see the bus until it hit me. So I spent 8 days at Vanderbilt University Hospital, next several months healing before I could walk. And here I am.
Oh my.
Thanks be to God.
Yes.
No kidding.
Well, the funny thing, Dr. Pryor, about all the reality now that we have about parasocial relationships is that I have long been following you on the Twitters and listening to your wisdom there. And so when people start posting, hey, please be praying for Karen because she decided to get run over by a bus. I was one of the people who well, it was a very quick decision. I was one of the people who was praying for you, who was bringing your needs and this incredibly horrible situation to the Lord. So,
thank you. Yes. He answered many prayers, and I'm grateful.
Has. And he is very faithful. But that we did not bring you on to for you to regale us with tales of buses and crosswalks. You have
that's a title for a book.
Well, we can let you write that next one.
No, not me. I think we get Dr. Pryor.
I think our book titles are better. Okay, so Dr. Pryor, you have, and I will try to call you Karen. It took me forever to not call Michael by what I used to call him when he was my professor. So I will also try to call you Karen. You're not just a doctor, always to be referred to as that. You are the recent author of The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. I am so thankful that you have written this book. I think this is a bad question, but I'm going to go with it anyway. What challenged you, or what came about around you that said, I think I need to write something about this. I'm seeing something around me and I need to bring it to the table.
Well, I wrote my doctoral dissertation many years ago on the influence of evangelicalism in the rise of the English novel in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I studied evangelical history through my study of literature. So I knew this history is a big part of how I understand myself and how I came to understand myself in doing that research. But when I eventually came to teach in evangelical institutions of higher education and was teaching younger generations of Christians who grew up in evangelical subculture, which I did not. I grew up in a Christian home, but really before a lot of this subculture rose to such prominence, I would teach literature, in particular Victorian literature, and many of my students would, in studying this literature, would comment on how so much of what the Victorians did and said and idealized was what they had been taught was Christian or biblical. And so we just began to ask this question, well, is this idea or this value or this, this thinking, is it really Christian or is it just Victorian? And so just asking that question over a number of years and sometimes posting things like that out on Twitter, and I would get a great response. I thought, I need to write a book about this because 21st century American evangelicalism really has a lot of Victorian influence, good and bad, but also we need to understand what is cultural versus what is biblical. So that was the beginning of the book.
And how is that exhibited? Give us some examples of where you saw Victorian ideas in American evangelicalism.
Yeah, well, the main ideas that sort of started this were ones around purity culture and sexuality. So if we know anything about Victorians, right or wrong, we might associate sort of prudishness towards sexuality with them, and unhealthy prudishness. I don't know if you know this, but evangelicals can be that way too. But
yes,
but even more devastating, a lot of the Victorian literature deals with the sexual double standard, one that says, hey, boys will be boys, but if a woman loses her virginity, whether through, a bad decision or even more often through force or just simply, not having any agency, then she is ruined for life. This is, a prevailing theme throughout Victorian literature. And I would have evangelical students come to me after class and tell me that they were ruined. And they were dealing with it in the same sort of devastating ways that, their Victorian counterparts from 2 centuries before were dealing with it. And that's when I began to see a real problem in the nuanced work of teaching biblical sexual morality, but alongside biblical notions of grace and forgiveness and mercy as well, which the Victorians didn't do very well. But lo and behold, neither are we in evangelicalism.
This sounds like, you see the big apparent thing, and it's the elephant in the room. Oh, we are doing a really bad job in this area of sexuality. And then we see that in the Victorian era. But my guess is you started peeling that onion and you started finding that the one big obvious thing became, unfortunately, one of many things you were seeing in great commonality with that Victorian era. What were some of those as you began? Again, it was a research thing that you had already done, so it was very familiar to you. I have not done vast amounts of reading in the Victorian era. And so there are things that you were covering in this book that were revelatory for me. What were some of the greater revelations for you as you started peeling back that onion, looking back?
Yeah, that's a great question, because my area of expertise is 18th and 19th century British literature, and along with that history. I know less about American history in that era, and far less about 20th and 21st century American history and politics. And of course, all of these things go together when we're talking about evangelicalism, because, well, I am an American and we're talking primarily about American evangelicalism in the context of this book. And so I had to do a lot of digging in the 20th century American evangelical history. And there were things that, everyone who studies this knows, but people like me, and I assume people who've studied less than me, know things that we don't know. So just something like discovery, I say discover because obviously it's all documented, but realizing that Ronald Reagan's famous Evil Empire speech was given before the National Association of Evangelicals. Like, who knew? Well, everyone knew, but I didn't. These are parts of our history that so obviously that played a prominent role in the rise of the religious right and our understanding of the Cold War and eschatology and a lot of biblical things connected to how we view America and how we view other nations around the world. Like this took place within evangelicalism, and so just things like that to understand how the history of politics right now in this moment began decades ago. It didn't just happen in 2016. It's been happening for a long time. So there are more recent things that I feel like I didn't know because I hadn't studied them. And, our cultural memory is short. There are so many things that we don't know about our own history that it wasn't that long ago. So I just sort of uncovered some of the things that were new to me.
Well, tell us about that. What were some of the things, what surprised you the most as you were doing this research?
I think there were things that I had already, that are part of history that I didn't know, like I just mentioned, the ties between Republican, I've been a lifelong Republican voter, just full disclosure, until recently. So this is me learning more about my own self and my own history, but learning some of the ways in which candidates that I consider to be just sort of conservative really were tied to other not just religious and evangelical, but even racial histories that kind of all go together. So I touch on those and give ample citations for anyone who wants to do more research on those topics. But one of the things that I just sort of discovered for myself in the process that I feel like I contributed perhaps to this understanding of our history is in my chapter on empire, which begins where I already said I began in 19th century Victorian literature. That's the age of the British Empire, and it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And so in thinking through the ways in which colonialism and imperialism are directly tied to our evangelical history, I saw some connection there between that history and our present, in which we, as evangelicals, love to build empires, right? Publishing empires, conference empires, online course empires of many kinds, which are not the same thing as, physical, geographical, political empires, but there's a mentality that comes along, I think, that is very similar. And so that was an interesting insight for me that helped me to understand, some of my own history and my own history within evangelicalism.
Did you feel, well, let me rephrase that. While I was reading, it hit me. I told Michael before we started recording, I said, Dr. Pryor writes in such a way that I am excited to lean in, and I am nodding my head. And then I am nodding my head to my own detriment, because I realize that she is slowly calling out things that I call dear and making them cultural. And now I have this moment, not a moment, but many moments of self-reflection going, oh my gosh, all these things that I thought were Christian, all these things that I thought were so dear, now I'm wondering how much of my faith have I thought was Christian as a pastor? How much have I taught from the pulpit? How much have I encouraged people to interpret scripture in such a way that in fact might have been cultural, in that when there was, the literary bomb. I don't know if you can actually throw literary bombs, but I would say Jesus and John Wayne kind of became that literary bomb for a lot of people reading it, having similar reflections to you of saying, so much that I thought I held dear, politically speaking, I am now seeing is not as clean as I thought it was. And following that historical chain is very eye-opening. How Have you heard from others who have also read your book, just kind of this eye-opening, oh my gosh, what is my faith now sort of reaction?
The response to the book has been along those lines. It's been very positive, and I think the comparison to Jesus and John Wayne is apt. Kristen Dumais is a historian. I'm an English professor, so we're coming from different academic disciplines, and our focus is a little bit different. But we're both talking about the way in which culture has such a heavy influence on our thinking and our believing and our living that we often, I use the metaphor in the book. I give that quote from David Foster Wallace, that famous one where, the fish are swimming in the fishbowl, and one swims by and says, "How's the water?" And the other says, "What water?" That is what culture is like for us. It's very hard to distinguish between our unexamined underlying assumptions and what is transcendent and universal and eternally true, because they're so enmeshed in one another. So that, yes, lots of people who've been reading the book have had that kind of response. And what I cover in the book is by no means exhaustive. What I'm really trying to do is to kind of make the point and show how this is the kind of discernment and distinctions, the kind of distinctions we need to continue to make as we live, as we grow, as we learn, especially as Christians.
It seems that in a way you say, it wasn't exhaustive, and certainly there's no book that's exhaustive. Every book is a different layer of scratching surfaces. In a way, though, it's funny. It's like, it's not so much like scratching the surface. It's like, I'm going to open this wound. All right, it's open. I haven't actually covered it yet. So I'm going to go over here and open this wound. And there's a lot of things that are open and need to be, I want to say, dealt with. You are not a prognosticator, but based on your study and trajectory that you have seen through literature and art, 18th century and moving forward, where do you think the future of evangelicalism is? And again, I'm not to spoil the book, but where do you think it could go? What are some things that could alter that trajectory?
Well, this movement that we call evangelicalism is, again, according to historians and so forth, is 300 years old. The word, of course, is older, and some people get stumble on that issue, but there is a literal movement that started in England and in America that's 300 years old and came to be called evangelicalism. And, so it hasn't always existed in this, it's within Christianity. So, and it hasn't always existed, and it may not always exist. I give the definitions and that history briefly in my book for anyone who wants to know. I'm not just making them up. And that really is the question. Is this thing that I think as an evangelical is powerful and positive, and because of its emphasis on individual conversion and activism and the Bible and Christ's crucifixion, is it going to last longer than this? Or will historians write later, because I think it's too early to tell, that this movement fractured and polarized beyond repair, and something else came out of it? If I had to bet, I would bet that's what will happen. I don't know what the term might be for the things that come out of it. But on the other hand, it is a global movement. It is not just American, and I'm seeing with 21st century American eyes. So, short answer is I don't know.
And I'm glad that you point that out in the book, because that has been a point of frustration on my part. Is who has given the right to Americans to define evangelicalism when the majority of evangelicals live outside of the Western world? Right. And so I was grateful that you point that out in the book.
Yeah, no, that is a very important point. And, I'm writing this book for this moment in American evangelicalism and emphasizing that, but it's very important to know that this movement is growing around the world. and with or without Americans. So we need to humbly acknowledge that, and again, let history show us what we learn and don't learn.
Yeah, and I think I know this wasn't a part of the book, but I think it needs to be mentioned that, in spite of the fact that the majority of evangelicals are outside of the Western world, there's still quite an influence. And I see it as I travel around the world that American evangelicalism has had an influence on other ideas of evangelicalism, but hopefully we'll be able to sort those sort of things out. I hope at least.
Well, this book is my small effort to at least show us one way to begin doing that, I hope.
When you went in and you were hitting Bebbington's, is it quadrilateral? Is that how it's referred to? Michael, you are the resident evangelical here. Would you please define for our listeners?
Bebbington.
I bet you could do it real quickly. What is Bebbington's quadrilateral?
Karen did. She defined it a moment ago. The activism, the cruciform nature. There are two others, and you've
biblicism and conversionism.
Yeah, thank you. And there are so many definitions of evangelicalism, and I think Bebbington's is a good, easily rememberable for most of us. But Alistair McGrath has 6 points, and we can go down a line of theologians who are defining what evangelicalism is. But I think what you point out, and this is important, that in the American context, in the Western context, the average person doesn't know these things, and they are taking the cues of culture to define what evangelicalism is. And I'd love for you to speak about that for a moment.
Yeah, I think that's, in a way, that's a big part of what I'm getting at in the subtitle when I use the word crisis, because, and I mentioned this in the book, the word, or maybe it's just in the PR materials for the book. But this word evangelical kind of shot into the vernacular through headlines in recent elections because it was being used as a category for polling and surveying and self-identification, really apart from these historical definitions. And so I do explain a little bit of that in the book, but as you said, that means if a pollster comes up to you and says, asks you the question, are you evangelical or born again? Which is the usual question that's asked. People can check yes based on whatever their understanding is, and they can also check yes because they understand themselves to be born again without necessarily being evangelical. But they often ask one or the other, and so we get a whole category of people who are labeled this way, who may or may not match up with any of the actual definitions that we accept.
And that's problematic, isn't it?
It is. We see many people who are, by any of these main definitions, evangelical, but rejecting the term because the people who are labeled that don't represent their views. So that's why I've actually, this is part of what I'm trying to do is maybe it's a quixotic effort to salvage a word or a term that I think has a good, long, rich, if very imperfect history against, from those who don't understand it and misuse it, and to say no. And that's why I still call myself evangelical, because a rose by any other name, right? I fit Bebbington's quadrilateral and the other major definitions out there.
So to help to bring some clarification, what other moniker or adjective to describe evangelical might we use to differentiate the definition of Bebbington and others from what we're seeing in the culture?
One of the terms that I use, and a lot of people I know use, it's not quite the same thing, but like small o orthodox, which I suppose some of those who who aren't evangelical and really consider themselves that might not agree with the use of that term. Just Christian is fine. Again, I think we're in this moment. I don't know what it will be called. And many people who are Christian actually tend to identify as simply Christian, and then their next label would be related to their church denomination. So evangelical really has become, in recent years, a term that's used mainly by those outside of evangelicalism to categorize people who are, come from very different denominations and very different traditions, and yet share these qualities in common.
And probably I would imagine, well, and I've seen this in other parts of the world, even the term Christian is not as preferred in some places just because of the connection of Christianity to the West.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do point out in the book is that the first followers of Christ called themselves followers of the way. They didn't even call themselves Christians, and that's an interesting. I think I knew that before writing the book, but it wasn't something I'd spent a lot of time thinking about, and that is very. I think it's very fruitful to think about because there's so much history there, so much meaning in that word versus the one that we use, and sometimes we get so attached to our man-made traditions and cultures that we think that is, the biblical truth. And when we look at the Bible a little more closely, we find out it's not.
It's almost like it feels to me that looking back, followers of the way, and they were called derogatorily little Christs, you
right.
little Christians, and then that stuck. We as Christians over the years, decades, and centuries have been called or called ourselves different things, and it seems right now this idea of latching on to that idea of evangelicalism or calling ourselves evangelical, it feels like a sinking ship. A little bit, and that we're trying to hold on to it, and the ship is going down, and we're saying no, this is a good term, I promise. And other people are saying this is a bad term because it is associated with this other thing that is completely not what you are. Even to what you're talking about, Michael, or that people might not want to associate themselves with the term Christian, right? Something that we're all trying to say, okay, this is the most base level. Just call yourself a Christian. And then that gets you lumped in with the West. And so I feel sometimes that we're trying to gravitate toward terms that are all different levels of sinking ships, that we're trying to run to the thing that we feel is the most accurate or the least offensive or isn't going to get us lumped in with something that we are not. So what's your timeline? Do you think evangelicalism as the American church is concerned, are we about to jettison that into the ether shortly, or how are we standing?
Yeah, well, I there's a thought that you just gave me in what you said, which is, it's not an original, but just we know this, but in what you just said about we insist on using these terms and labels. And what does the Bible say about how people will know? It is not by what we call ourselves. They will know we are Christians by our love one for another and by our showing the fruit of the Spirit. So anyway, just some light bulbs were going off for me that I'm feeling challenged and almost indicted by your words. I'm a word person, so I do and I also do tend to want to cling to the old words and definitions. But you're absolutely right. There comes a point where that becomes not only futile, but maybe even harmful to our faith and our witness and the church. Timeline, in the book, I suggest that when I talk about the First Reformation, Protestant Reformation 500 years ago, and I suggest that it's time for another Reformation. I think the moment is that big. It's at least like a 500-year moment. It may be a 1,000-year moment. I have some friends who talk in different terms and talk about something that broad and sweeping. And so I do think we're in a moment. How long it will take, I don't know. Things move much more rapidly in modernity than they did before. So I guess in my mind, I think to myself that I might not live to see the turn and the new moment, but I think people younger than me will, and so I'm motivated a great deal by being faithful and strong for them.
So if we do our work, Mark Knoll will add another turning point in his book, Turning Points, marking the change in Christianity. Would you say? I mean, if I'm reading between the lines, I don't think you're calling for another schism, but is that the level of change you're talking about?
I'm not calling for it; it's happening.
Well, and it's going to be multi-faced, isn't it? I mean, it's I think the day of one monolithic Reformation, I don't think we'll ever see that. We're so polarized in American evangelicalism that whatever Reformation occurs, it's going to be, it'll have multiple faces.
Right. I agree. That's sort of the nature of living in late modernity versus, pre-modernity. But I do think it will be something that is, I think, post-institutional in some respects. And I say that as someone who my whole life has devoted my entire life to institutions and has always believed in institutions. And that doesn't mean new institutions won't be created and built, but I think the kinds of, empires that we have built now that are built on anything but the pure, unadulterated gospel, those will end, and something new will form in some new ways. With the categories that we have now won't hold; they aren't holding. So,
as somebody like yourself, who I feel myself in a similar boat, that there's so much of my work and so much of my effort and time have unintentionally been to keep the institution. Hooray for institution, and let's build this thing. And looking back, have those all treated us very well? Have we benefited from the institution as much as we thought we would in keeping them about or seeking to establish them for a longer time? If there is and again, I think I really appreciate how you say we can call for whatever schism or lack of schism we want. It's happening. Where do we go when we start talking about moving away from the institutions? How do we actually move that idea of I don't want to use, because gospel centered. That is such a washed out term now because it has been adopted by so many, co-opted probably more accurately. How does the church move forward away from institutions from your vantage point, Karen?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to tee you up here, Karen, because I think I might know a part of the answer, because that's what your book is about in some way, is that we need new imagination. I mean, the socially constructed imagination that we have, the metaphors that we've been using that you so brilliantly lay out in the book, in some way those have to change and evolve. I don't know if that's the right word, progress, become... Well, I mean, we need to discover new metaphors. Right. It seems, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm trying to show in the book. And just to go back to something Andrew said about the institutions, the question, have we benefited from them? I want to say I have benefited greatly, and that's the problem. That's the problem. I benefited so much that it was easy to be blind to the ways in which institutions were harming others and harming the church. And so that's part of the renewal of my own imagination, and my own decisions to give up those benefits without knowing what's next, and knowing only that I have Jesus, and that I see others doing the same, who are turning to Jesus. And I don't know how that part ends up, because we're just in this moment where I just see so many. I talk briefly about the word deconstruction in the book. It's a metaphor that makes people nervous, because many of the people who first used that term were leaving the faith, deconverting. But there are many, many more who are doing exactly what I'm describing in this book, which is to examine, the undergirding joists and floorboards and structures of the house, to see which ones are rotten and get rid of those, so that we can, rebuild the house. And I'm seeing people who are doing that work of disentangling the cultural from the biblical, and finding Jesus and finding the Bible. And so that's what I think is happening now. And what will emerge out of that, I don't know. But this is a very necessary step, I think, to just sort of shed the extraneous, get back to the basics, then I don't know what happens, and I lost track of your question. But it does involve using our imaginations, because we can debate doctrine all day. That's, you go on Twitter, that's what happens. And I find, I agree with the doctrine of so many people that how do I want to put this? That I see nothing of Jesus in.
Ooh.
That I'm forced to think about these matters in ways that aren't just about doctrine, but are about imagination, about being, not just believing, but being, in our posture and loving others, even as we hold to the truths that we believe.
Dang. Well, Karen, I appreciate so much of what you have said in this book. And I think the longer Michael and I keep interrogating you with questions that are popping into our minds, what's going to happen is we're going to unintentionally spoil or give people a reason not to read the book. And we don't want that.
No, we don't.
Yeah, but people need to go out and buy this book. This is fantastic. I love what you've done. I love the fact that you have so many resources that we can follow up on. In fact, they distract me, but in a good way.
Yeah, and I also want to say thank you for how you wrote it. And I can't blame you for the timing that I read it, because we were in London and we did not have enough time to see all the things that we wanted to see. We literally went into the Tate. We went into this museum. We essentially went in there to use the restroom and then leave, because that is the blessing of free museums. And we saw a few pieces. My wife got some photos next to like some of her favorite pieces that were there, and we were gone. We were out in 5 minutes. And then, like literally a day later, I'm reading in your book and it's like, this piece is in the Tate, and this piece is in the Tate, and this piece is in the Tate. And so now, thank you for writing this book, because now it forces me to go back to London and see some of these wonderful illustrations you have for some of your pieces. But it was an honor to have you on the podcast today. If somebody, besides buying the book, this book and On Reading Well, how can they follow up with you or keep track of what you are doing out in the world?
Yeah, well, my most invigorating project right now is my Substack newsletter, where I am writing about British literature. We're on the Canterbury Tales now, and a lot of people are enjoying reading or rereading the Canterbury Tales with me. But I also make a lot of, current day applications. So if you want to see, just how literature does reflect life, and evangelical life in particular, you can find me on Substack at The Priory. That's probably the project I'd love to people to join in, along with reading the book. And you can just catch up with me briefly, all the things I do at my website, karenswallowprior.com.
Has anybody given you an award for calling it the Priory, because I think they should have. I mean, that was a brilliant work of linguistics wordsmithing. So well done.
I'll take the award. Thank you.
There we go. Well, Dr. Pryor, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who have tuned into this podcast because of our wonderful guest, we would love for you to delve deeper into the resources that we have at the Ephesiology Podcast, or you can join us on Facebook, where we end up continuing these conversations. And as referenced earlier, the increasing online courses, Ephesiology is a part of that. We have masterclasses.ephesiology.com, and we want to invite you into your own growth, as well as what God might be doing in and through you in this church, in the world at large. So on behalf of Karen, Michael, and myself, thank you for joining us on the Ephesiology Podcast.